Hi there, my name is Abu and welcome to my channel. In this tutorial, we'll be handling one major problem that managing state within one component brings, and this is called prop drilling. So imagine you have state in component B and you want to move this state data all the way to component E. This means that you have to use props through component A all the way to app.js file, and then from app.js file again you have to move all this data through props again all the way down to component E. As you can see, this data is going to move through props from component B to A to app.js and then through C, D all the way down to E. Already, if you think about it, this state data from component B moving through props all the way down to component E already brings in a huge chunk of code which we really don't need. And two solutions to this. One of them is the Context API that comes out of the box when you install React, and we have Redux, which is a third-party library that is also used to solve this problem. But both of these two solutions use the same idea to solve the problem. So this state data is saved into one section of the application. This is going to be the source of truth for the whole application. It's registered through app.js. All other components subscribe to this state data through app.js and pick whatever data that they are going to need. So in this video, I'm going to show you how to work with Context API that comes straight out of the box from React, and I'll make another video for Redux. So without wasting any more time, let's jump in and get started. So I have this very simple counter application that I built. It really doesn't do anything much. It just has an input, and the user can increment by 5 or can reduce by 5, whatever value that they set for the counter. In order for you to follow along, I suggest you download this simple application. I will leave a link in the description to my GitHub repository, and we can get started. So once you finish downloading and installing, you need to go to your terminal, Ctrl+tilde, and type in npm install so that it can install all the modules that we installed for this application or that we are using for this application. Once the installation is complete, we're going to start the application, npm start. Once your server is running, you should see a very simple application like this. Nothing works yet if you click on the buttons, but we will handle this when we start coding our Context API solution. A simple walkthrough, we have the state that we are using. If you haven't watched my video on React state yet, you should find the link somewhere on this video. I advise you to watch it before coming to watch this one. So we have the input, and we also have a button to initialize the state to that specific number by the user, and we have another button for decrement and another button for increment. Before we get started with the Context API, there are two hooks that you need to understand. This is the useReducer and the useContext. So in this video, we will handle useReducer. Like I said in my React state video, you cannot use hooks if you're using class components. In this case, I'm using a function components, which you should be using from this point on in your next projects in case you're using class components. Up here, we need to import the useReducer. And just as we destructured useState, we have to destructure useReducer as well. Down here, constant, we shall destructure it, but we're picking it from useReducer. So we are destructuring the application state and the dispatch method. Now, this state is just the state of the application, and this dispatch is what dispatches an action to the reducer and tells the reducer on how to update the state. The reducer takes two arguments and some reducer function. By convention, this is just called reducer function, and some initial state. So from the top, we need to initialize the state that we are going to be using throughout our component. Constant init state, and this is an object that has key value pairs, but in this case we want the count and we shall initialize the count to 0. So on the top, we create the reducer function, and it takes two parameters. This is the state of the application and some action that is sent by the dispatch method. This is going to return something. These actions may be 3, 4, 5. So normally by convention, we put it in a switch statement and we switch action.type. Up to this point, I have mentioned an action, I have mentioned a reducer, but I'm sure you're not really understanding what these two things are. So basically, this reducer function is going to take an instant of the store or the state and returns the updated version of that state. And in order for this reducer to know what to update in the state, it requires a block of code called an action. Basically, this action describes what has just happened. For example, when we want the user to set this counter or the count to 5, so they will input the 5, and then when you initialize from the button, this action picks up that number and then tells the reducer that set this count to 5. Basically, that's how an action works. And also an action may not just be of a type, but this action can also carry a payload. Judging from our application, one of the actions is going to be to reduce by 5, and the other action definitely is going to be to increment by 5. So back to the application, we have one action, which is a case if you've used switch statement before. So in the case of addition, we want to return. Remember, you should never mutate your state, so you have to use the spread operator to bring in the whole state, and then you only update a specific part of the state. And the part we want to update is the count that you see down here. So the count is going to be state.count plus 5. And that is the first action. And the second action is definitely going to be subtraction. And this will return, and again, we do not mutate the state, but use the spread operator to copy the entire state, and then only update a specific part of the state that you want. So in this case, it's state.count, so minus 5. And down at the bottom, what if none of these cases have been executed? We need to have a default case, and this should just return the state as it is. So now it's time for us to test out this implementation of the reducer. So down here on the button, we have another prop, and this is on click. So what happens when this button is clicked? So when the button is clicked, this should execute an anonymous function that returns the dispatch function that we destructured from the useReducer. And in this dispatch function is where we describe our action. So for this case, when it's less by 5, so the type of action is going to be subtraction. And on the next button, we also have another prop here, which is on click, the same as the one above. And just as the one above, this is going to have an anonymous function that returns the dispatch function, and we describe the state, the type of action that we want, and in this case it's going to be addition. So let's try this implementation and see if it works. I'm going to save this, Control S, and back to the application, reload the page, and this is not working yet. What is going on? So back to our code, we are displaying a counter here, but we are not supposed to display a counter anymore. We're supposed to display something from this state that is coming from the useReducer, not something that's coming from the use state. So down here, instead of counter, we're going to call state, but remember this state is an object and it has the count that we want to display to the user. So save this, back to the application, and this should be able to increment and decrement. This is not happening, something is wrong with this decrement button. So back to our application, we go back and see when we click what's happening. Okay, I missed a C here. So subtraction, and then save this back to the application, and they should work. So as you can imagine, we are using a state instead of just the use state hook. We're using the useReducer, and this useReducer takes the entire state that we have here, and then what happens is that it updates that state according to an action that is sent by the dispatch function. This is very, very interesting, and this is very, very important that you understand how this useReducer works. So the next section is going to be, we want the initialize button to work, and this is not working anymore. So basically what this means that if I input the number 5 here and I click on initialize, it should update this number from the state to the number 5 before we can start incrementing or decrementing. So back to the application. Basically this is still a button, but this button is not doing anything right now. And obviously we need to bring in the prop, that is the on click. So when somebody clicks on this button, what happens? This is the same as the previous buttons. It's an anonymous function that returns the dispatch function, and in this dispatch function is where we're going to define the type init count. And now from this button we have to send a payload, because the user is going to have an input something, and then when the reducer executes that type of init count, this should take as a payload that is going to be updated to the state. So in the dispatch function we also have the payload property of this object. So this payload is going to be, the value here is init, which is the value that is going to be picked from the input from the user, and it is stored in this init. And the payload that we are going to send through this action type is going to also be init. And this payload doesn't have to be an integer, it can be anything. It could be a string, it could be a boolean, it could be a float, it doesn't really matter. So, but in this case we want the input from the user, and that is the init, that is going to be sent to the reducer function, and this is going to update the state. So I'm going to save this and back to my application. When I reload the page and I put here number 5 and I hit initialize, this is not updating this state. So this is your assignment 1. I want you to pause the video right now and figure out why this state is not updating. Spend about 5 to 10 minutes on this and come back and look at my solution. So in my solution, this is very simple. The reason why this action type has not been executed by the reducer function is because we haven't added it to this switch statement. So before the default case, we're going to come here and call this case of init count, and this will return, we have to spread again the state. We do not want to mutate the state, so use the spread operator, and on the count, instead of subtracting by 5, we just have to pass in action.payload. So we have access to this action because it's one of the parameters in this function, and we are switching action.type because we have different types, like the addition is a type, subtraction is a type, and init count is also a type. But the count here, when the user presses the button and this init count type is executed, we are sending a payload to update the count. So let's save this and see what happens. Back to my application, I'll reload this page and give this 5 and click initialize, and you notice that my count has been initialized to the value which is coming from the user. So I can continue updating this, subtracting and adding. I can also change this, give it 100. When I hit initialize, the value of count will still be updated to the value that's coming from the user, and you can start playing the game again, update by 5 or less by 5. So basically that is how the reducer function works. This is a whole new project and we are going to take this to the next level. So from the previous project, we only had one page and we're only using the useReducer. But in this next project, we're going to bring in the useContext from React. So this is another new project, nothing fancy really, but it has a navigation to different pages of the application. And I'll leave the link to this GitHub repo in the description. You can download it. And after cloning the repo, make sure you run npm install to install all the packages that we are using for this project. And once that is done installing, run the project, npm start. And this right here is the application that we're working with. Nothing fancy really. We have 3 pages. We have the home page and we have a simple message, and we have the about page. This is the about page component, and the users page. Since this link doesn't exist, I also put in like an error page, and you can do these designs. And if you haven't watched my video on React routing, be sure to check on the link on the description or find the video somewhere on this video. So back to the application. This is the app.js component. Nothing fancy really. Just have the links to the home page and about page, and we switch the routes to those specific pages. And I have my pages folder where I have my home page component, error page, and home page. So we want to bring in context into this application. So first thing we're going to do is in source folder, we're going to create a new folder and we're going to call it context. And this is where all our context files are going to be stored. So the first file we're going to create is app.context.js. And the next file we're going to create is appstate.js. And these two will handle the context API for our entire application. So one file at a time. In app.js, we're going to basically have 3 lines. And one of them is we're going to import something from React. And if you must have guessed, what we're importing here is createContext. And as it says, this is what is going to create the context for our entire application. And the next one, we have to initialize this context constant. I'm going to call it app.context, and I'm going to initialize createContext. And in here, you can add anything that you want, some default values, but we shall not work with this createContext inside this app.context file. But then we shall export this, and then we shall use it in appstate.js. So export default app.context. And that's it. We are done with appcontext.js. So basically, we are importing createContext, which is a hook from React, and that is what's going to manage our state data throughout the entire application. And then we initialize it down here and we export it, and that's it. Basically 3 lines of code. I can even close this. I don't need it anymore. So in app.js, appstate.js, and if you notice, I named this using an uppercase letter, meaning that basically this is also a component. So from the top, first things first, we're going to import React from React. And the next thing, we're going to import app.context from the same folder and app.context module. And the next part is we're going to initialize appstate, and this is going to take some props. We will see how the props come in shortly. And this is going to return the provider, and this provider comes from the app context. So app context.provider. So this provider has a value prop, and this is what is going to be recognized by the application as the state for the entire application. So I can start with name just to show you how this is working out. My name is Abu, and I'm going to save this. And in between, I'm going to have props.children. Again, I will show you shortly why this is important to add. So props.children, and I'm going to save this. And at the end, I have to export something. And since this is a component, I have to export the app state function. So export default app state, and I'm going to save this. So basically, this is what we do in this appstate.js in the context API. Now I have to register my app.js module with this app state module that's coming from the context API. So in app.js, basically, since I want all of this to be moved through the routes, I'll register the switch statement within the app state so that the app state can provide the state to all these routes that we're going to navigate to. So from the top, I have to import app state first. So import app state from, so go into context folder and app state. And now I want to wrap the switch statement in app state. Since this is a component, app state, this, and all the way down, I'll wrap the whole switch inside app state. I have to close it like that. Save this. Now, basically this means that this app.js and inside app.js within the switch statement, any of these pages that we navigate to has access to the state through the app state and through the provider that we're providing these values to those components. But the question is, how do we access this value from the state from those other components? All the way to the home page, we want to access the name, because over here I gave it a simple value. My name is Abu. Now we want to access this from the home page. You can imagine we are not using any props to send this name to homepage component. All we do is wrap the whole switch statement and any route that we want to access the state using the app state, and the provider will provide these other components. All we have to do is subscribe into that specific context. Now from the top, we have to import something, and that is app context. And this app context is imported from, so you move one step back and go to the context folder and pick it from the app context, and this is located in app context over here. So this is what we are picking from the homepage component. Now, how do we access this data? So first things first, over here we need to destructure something, because this value that is coming from the provider is an object. So we have to destructure that object over here, and we destructure that object from use context. But this use context is not imported yet. So from React, like I said, all this comes out of the box from React. So use context, and we destructure app context, because this app context is what is carrying the data. All the data that is coming from the value is brought in through the app context here that we imported from app context. And now what are we destructuring? And what we're destructuring basically here is the name value. So over here I'll destructure name, and when I come down here I can create another paragraph, but then I want to use the name that I'm getting from the context API. So when I save this, I go back to my home page and I should see my name is Abu. Very, very beautiful. So you can imagine that we didn't use any props. All I did was register this context from app context, whatever is coming from here, because this app context is coming from the createContext hook, and this is coming from React. And since we talked about context API, so this is what is going to wrap the whole application, and it will provide any other component that is registered using use context, and it gives it all the access to the state that is coming from the value, and this is coming from the provider. So back to the home page. After destructuring this, you can use this object property anywhere in the code, like we used it here, and it brings in my name is Abu. And if we try changing this, for example, it doesn't only have to be a name, Since this is an object, I can also call maybe age. I can say Abu's age is maybe 25, and I can say food, maybe rice. And I'm gonna save this. So if I want to have access to age and food also, so this time I'm gonna go to about page and I'll do the same here. So on the top, first things first, I also want to import useContext, and I'll also have to import the app context that is coming from the context folder and in the app context module. So down here, I have to destructure something from useContext, and this useContext method takes the context, which is app context. And what am I destructuring here? I'm destructuring name and age and food. Very good. Now down here, I have access to the state data, and I can say my name is Abu. So paragraph name, my name is Abu, and I am age old. My favorite food is, and I pick food. Very good. So when I save this, back to my application, when I go to about page, I should see my name is Abu and I am 25 years old and my favorite food is rice. Basically, my name is Abu is coming from the state, 25 is coming from the state, and rice is also coming from the state. This makes your work very, very easy, other than having a whole chunk of code that we do not need. Now, I want us to take this to the next level. Let me show you. Now, in app state, I want to change the background color of the homepage if the user is above 18 or not. So in this case, this is where I'm going to bring in use state, and down here we have to destructure use state. We're going to say is old and then set is old, and this is coming from use state, and initially the value is going to be false. So down here I'm going to send is old. That's what I'm sending through my state. So I'm sending is old. So back to the home page. Since I already have this coming from the state, all I have to do is add something here. So is old. That's all I have to add over there. And now I want to set this background color, a specific color, if is old is true, and or another color if is old is false. So for this case, is old is going to be false. So I'm going to set the style, and I'm going to set the background color according to if is old is true or false. And to set this, we're going to use a ternary operator. So if you haven't worked with ternary operators yet, this is more like a condition to test. So if is old question mark and semicolon, this means that it has three parts. So the ternary operator, it checks the value that you're setting it to, and it has the true, this is the true part of the ternary operator, and this is the false part of the ternary operator. So when is old is true, I want to set the background to green, and if is old is false, I want to set the color to red. So I'm gonna save this. Back to my application, I'm gonna go to the home page, and this is going to be red because remember this is false. If you look at our code, we started this as is old is false. If I change this to true, so I'm going to change this to true, save this. Back to my application on the home page, this is going to be green because is old is equal to true. Now I want to add a button that's going to switch these colors. I'm going to add a small button here. So back to my application, in my home page, underneath the name, I'm going to add a simple button, and this button, let me just say switch edge. And what happens on click? Now on click is where we are going to switch it from true to false, but we don't have access to set is old. So how do we do this? This is really easy. Back to app state, this value takes really anything. Now I'm going to bring in set is old. You can ask a question, but Abu, why don't you have the value of is old? Because basically I would have set is old to is old like that, but this is a repetition, and in JavaScript ES6, if the name of your object is going to be the same name as the value, you can just leave it as one, the same as is old. I don't have to again come back here and say set is old, no. But you can notice the difference in the colors, meaning that set is old is actually a method, and we are sending this method also within the state of the application. This is very, very interesting. This is very, very powerful also. So back to the home page, I have is old. I also want to bring in set is old. And now on this button, what happens on click? This is going to have an anonymous function that returns set is old, and set is old is going to definitely be the opposite of is old, meaning that just set this to the opposite of is old, like that. So if is old is equals to true, this exclamation mark is going to set it to the opposite. So if this is true, set is old is going to be set to false, and if it is false, it's going to be set to true. So initially is old is still false, that's why this is red, but when I click the button, this is going to set it to true, and by true is going to be green. Switch this and that. As you can see, you can keep switching between, and all of this is coming from the state, from the app state over here, and this is very, very powerful. So for this case, I won't really need food and rice. I can do away with this. I don't need this anymore. So I'm going to save this. So I do not really need any of this anymore. And back to the home page, I will also do away with name. I'm not using this anymore. And I'll also do away with it from the about page. I'm not using any food or any age. Now, just to show you that this cuts across all components, I want to also bring in is old this side on about page. So is old, and we don't need this anymore, name, food and age, because they're not in our state anymore. But now I want to have it the opposite this side. I want to set my style also here to a simple background color. It's going to be, if is old is true, I want it to be red, and if it is false, I want it to be green. Very simple like that. So I'm gonna save it. So back to my application, initially it's false. If I reload this page, it's going to be false. When I go to about page, I should see green because I set it to be green if it is false. Now if I come back to the home page and click this, so that is true. When I go to about page, I should see the true side, which is red. So back to the home page, when I click this, this is red, and the value of the state will stay the same, and this has changed to green. So basically I have used this state data from the use context, and I haven't used props to move this data from the home page to the about page. Basically I am using that data because I've subscribed these components to that data, and that's how I can manipulate it from one component and still have access to it from another component. This is very, very powerful and very, very interesting. And now back to app state, I want to show you the reason why we have this props.children, because basically this is still a component, and a component has props. If you haven't watched my video on props, you can find the link in the description, or you can also find the link to the video somewhere on this video. But if I remove these props, for example, let me comment it out, and I save this, let's see what happens. I will not have anything that is going to be sent from the home component and about component and the users component, because anything that is coming from the home component and the users component, that becomes a child of this app context. Because if you look at the app.js file, we are wrapping these components over here into the app state component, which is coming from the app state from the context API. So to have the children back, just remove the comments and save this, and back to the home page, we should see this button and we can switch the colors. So that is all for me concerning Context API. If you have any questions, please leave a comment below on this video, or if you have anything to add on, you can also leave some comments on this video. And I hope you understood this and you can start using it in your next project. So stay hungry and stay foolish. See you in the next tutorial.